Thank you very much. This is always one of these moments when you think, I'm going to fall up the stairs, or I'm going to trip up as I walk up, or lose the microphone, which I managed to do, so I apologise for being a bit late. And I also apologise for speaking in English. And I thank you for your forbearance and for your much better education system, which means that you can understand me, whereas unfortunately I can't understand you. I could just about get away with the French, thankfully, but not by much. The first thing I should do is, well, I'm certainly not Jens Alder, although I can make an attempt. But I should first make a disclaimer. I am, as was described, an inquiry chairman of the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK, but my comments today are entirely my own and should in no way be interpreted as being, oh, I've arrived, yes, the policy of the Competition and Markets Authority or any other branch of the UK government. So now that's out of the way, I was asked to talk about the UK approach of dealing with media and media regulation. And I'm certainly not going to lecture you about what you should or shouldn't do in Switzerland, because that would be an incredibly arrogant and stupid thing to do. But I was simply trying to explain how we have evolved our own system of dealing with what is, after all, a very large and well-known public service broadcaster, the BBC. Now, normally when we say BBC, we feel a great urge to salute, because it is such an incredibly important part of our culture and our understanding and our way of life that it feels part of the family, which for those of you who know enough about the UK would know that the BBC's nickname is actually Auntie. And so it's known as a part of the family. But if you look at where we're moving in the UK, and I think where you're also moving, I wonder in these conferences whether, particularly the people who are hidden at the back, who are under the age of 30, should actually be the ones doing most of the talking, because what we're looking at now in the media environment is, I mean, you can call it a revolution, but a merging of different methods of delivery. We have internet, we have broadcast, we have telephony. And as we got used to the idea of triple play, along comes quad play, which is the latest problem we're dealing with, which is the addition of mobile. And when you consider, you know, as we've said many times, but means a lot to those of us who have grey hair and can remember what it was like having a landline only, having something in your pocket which you watch TV with, which has more computing power than NASA had to put the first person on the moon, means an awful lot to those of us over the age of 30. It doesn't mean anything to you under 30 because you're used to this and it's just part of your life. But the impact that is having on broadcast is incredibly important, and it's incredibly important for the UK in terms of also how we regulate them. And I think that is, for us, I think, and for me looking at the market, is a very, very important part of the discussion. Because when you look at broadcast, when you look at the elements of broadcast in the UK environment, we have an interlocking system of largely independent regulation. And that's an incredibly important part of the system. We have some very strict rules, we have some very interesting rules, which I'll mention in a wee bit. But if you look at the market overall, in terms of what we have to deal with in the UK, we obviously have the BBC, we have ITV, Channel 4, Channel 5, who are public service broadcasters. I mean, it's interesting hearing your discussion of public service broadcasters. All of our main terrestrial channels are defined as being public service broadcasters, those that take advertising and those that don't. Now, obviously, our main public service broadcaster, the BBC, has no advertising, none at all. And it's interesting to come to a country where you have a mix. We have independent broadcasters who take advertising, and I was brought up in a family that didn't generally let me watch ITV because it took advertising. Terribly low grade. My goodness, it's commercial. Television should be there to educate and to inform, and only just about to entertain. That's the Reithian model that we've had in the UK. But we now have Freeview, we now have a digital terrestrial, we have cable, we have satellite, we have Netflix, we have Amazon, we have Sky, we have an awful lot of broadcast media that actually operate on quite different models. When it comes to income levels, for the BBC, we have the subscription. We pay, I gather, less than you do, which I was quite delighted by. Whenever you pay a tax of any description, it's always too high. But I gather we only pay about half of what you pay, which made me a very happy Brit, it has to be said. Whatever else I've learned over the last few days, it's that maybe our license fee isn't quite as expensive as it always feels when you pay it. But that accounts for about 2.7 billion in terms of income. So actually not, in terms of population, it's interesting when you look at the figures. The commercial public service broadcasters get around 2.4 billion. The vast majority of that is advertising revenue, obviously. We have other commercial channels, so the non-public service broadcasting, which there are a very large number of, as I was explaining over lunch to some, we have channels that specialise in just 24-hour quiz shows and 24-hour just repeats of programmes that you didn't really want to watch the first time round. But there are people that do want to watch them again for 24 hours, which, hey, that's choice for you. And then we have the subscription channels, the Sky, who built themselves up very entrepreneurial on the back of mainly sports rights and movie rights, and interestingly, movie rights less so now because of the emergence of people like Netflix. And their income is somewhere around 6 billion. So it's a very large market, and it's a very diverse market in the way in which it's divided. But when you look at the challenges that I think everyone is facing, it's not unique to Switzerland or the UK or any market. The technology evolution, the means by which people deal with media, and that's why I was saying we need to talk to the people under 30 in the room, because what they're doing now is going to dictate what the media markets look like in 15 years' time, 10, 15 years' time, when they are the people who currently, in our case, actually sit and watch TV. I mean, I sit and watch TV far too much. But I sit and watch TV, and I watch far too much sport. My entire weekend is sport. It's rugby, 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 football, rugby, football, unless it's cricket, when it's just all day. But when I look at how my kids consume media, my daughter went away to university. She hasn't got a TV. I said, do you want a TV? Shall we get you a TV? What do I want a TV for? I've got Netflix, I've got Amazon, I've got Now TV, I've got BBC iPlayer. Why do I want a TV? And her idea of consuming media is she'll watch Korean soap operas. Go figure. She and I watched Shaw Brothers movies from the 1970s, great kung fu movies. I highly recommend them to everyone. We've got Netflix for all the Marvel content, box sets of Daredevil, seriously great show. Preacher on Amazon, again, brilliant show. If you get the chance to watch it, absolutely superb. But the way in which people are consuming media is entirely different. My son spends his entire time playing Call of Duty whilst watching Rhett and Link on YouTube. Thankfully, I can't understand that at all, which makes me feel very old and actually quite grateful, because if I did, I would be rather sad. Linear broadcasting is changing hugely. People of my age still sort of watch live TV, not just the event TV. I mean, we watch football, and we watch rugby, and cricket, and basically anything that involves sport, and occasionally movies. And my son will watch those with me because he's equally sad. But we're now getting to the point where 50% of 18 to 24-year-olds no longer watch linear TV. They just don't. And so we have Netflix and chill. I say that to the under 30s. Which we have different ways of dealing with media. And we have to have a regulatory environment that allows that evolution of media to occur. Because if we don't, we stifle innovation, and we stifle innovation which is moving with people's lives. I mean, I will now happily watch football on my phone. I watched a very important rugby match on the train back home and on the platform, and waited for a taxi afterwards. And I need to have a regulatory environment that allows me to do that. So in a UK environment, we have a multiplicity of operations. We have public service broadcasting, and it's obviously very central to the way in which we deal things. We have the Reithian ideal of informing, educating, and entertaining, central to the thing. And we have to have universal access. Those are the two key elements of public service broadcasting. So everyone has to be able to watch it, and it has to have a degree of public service involved in it. As I said, all of the main terrestrial channels have an element of public service broadcasting, a lot of it around news. Now, that may change over time, because actually, particularly 18 to 24-year-olds, the amount of news that they consume from established media dropped something like 30% in the UK in the space of 4 or 5 years. And we're seeing an awful lot more news media arriving through Twitter, Facebook, which I think can present some problems, because we're increasingly living in rather isolated bubbles from each other. But despite all of the innovation, the public service broadcasters still account for around 70% of all viewing. So it's still a very, very significant element. And we've had a number of challenges over the years, which has led to the regulatory environment we currently have. And a fair bit of that has come from attempts by the BBC to become more commercial. And we had what would pass for a controversy in the UK mainly around magazine spin-offs from shows. So Match of the Day, which is the sole reason for most men coming home from the pub on a Saturday night, which is the highlights programme for the Premier League, started producing its own magazine. And the BBC started producing magazines based around their most popular shows. So Top Gear, Match of the Day, lots of baking shows, which still are stunningly popular, which I really do not understand. I need to ask my daughter, because she loves these things. Bake Off. Anyone watch Bake Off? Yeah, I don't get that. Like Strictly Come Dancing, I just don't, that's just beyond me. But the BBC started producing a huge number of magazines, and the commercial publishers naturally said, guys, we've already got a market with, as a kid, Match and Shoot, seriously good magazines when you're a teenage boy who likes football. You're coming along with Match of the Day, subsidised by the money you get from the licence fee. This is unfair. This is unfair competition. And so there was a big debate about what we should do about these things. What we ended up with in the UK are I think some very useful principles for public service broadcasters, based around what we call fair trading principles. And for these, we have a number of core rules for how the BBC operates. Firstly, the BBC has to comply with competition law and state aid law. So European state aid law applies to the BBC. Now, that may sound a bit overly technical, but there was a recent, and for us quite a scandal because it involves the weather. And the British, as you may know, are obsessed about the weather. But the weather contract, the contract for providing weather forecasts on the BBC, was so big that it came under the state aid rules. And so they had to have an open competition. And the Met Office, which is part of, again, our infrastructure, because it's about the weather, which we're obsessed with, lost the contract to a private service provider who will now be providing our weather forecast. Apparently, they're keeping most of the weather forecasters on, which I think has stopped the shock being quite as major as it could be. If we'd lost our weather forecasters, I think there would have been riots in the street. But there we see an application where the contract was significant enough where they had to put it out to tender, and we changed providers for the BBC itself. So it has to be compliant with competition law. It can't use license fee money for commercial activities. The commercial activities of the BBC, which are actually quite successful, particularly BBC Worldwide, which is the international arm, has to be separate, functionally separate. If there are magazines, they have to be accounted separately, and they can't be funded, but they can't be cross-subsidised or launched on the back of licence fee money. The licence payers' money is solely for the broadcast activities of the BBC. Commercial activities have to be accounted for separately. Now, BBC Worldwide ploughs back £200 million at last count back into the BBC for programming, which is great, but it is functionally separate. So when we sell Doctor Who around the world, that is done on a separate accounting basis. When carrying out the public service broadcasting, it has to take account of its competitive impact on the rest of the market. And there's a constant debate, and I heard some of it reflected in previous comments, about what should the BBC do? Should the BBC be making popular programmes? It's a bit of a weird debate. Should it be making Bake Off? Should it be making Strictly Come Dancing? I mean, I ask those questions just because I don't like the programmes. But there's always a debate about what should the public service broadcaster do. Should it make just lots of boring, worthy programmes? Or should it be allowed to make popular, exciting programmes? And there's a constant discussion that goes on about how far you should push this. And I don't think there's actually an easy answer. There's no easy answer to this at all. Because you don't want to have a rump, boring broadcaster and then leave everything potentially interesting, because that actually takes an element of competition out of the broadcast market as well. So it's a bit of an area for open debate. Any commercial activity the BBC does have to be consistent with public service obligations. So it can't just run off and become something else somewhere else in the world. And it has to comply with fair trading rules. So when you look at its role as a commercial player, it has to fit with the public service ethos. It has to be commercially efficient and independent of its other activities. Can't damage the reputation or standing of the BBC, and has to comply with the fair trading guidelines, in particular by avoiding distortions to the markets. And you now see, if any of you have the pleasure of watching the BBC, you'll now see an awful lot of the programming is actually provided by independent production companies. Because again, the amount of spend that the BBC has, because it has to be compliant with competition laws and with its own fair trading guidelines, it can no longer produce everything just in-house. And increasingly it has to share the sports rights that it has, particularly those that are granted under what we call the crown jewels. So there are a set of broadcast sporting events which are classified as so centrally important to our national culture that they cannot be sold at market rate. And that's the Six Nations Rugby, which is centrally important to my entire life in the winter. Winter would not be worth living without Six Nations Rugby. I have to put that on the table as a Welshman. Living without rugby in the winter would just be, I don't know how you do it. I really don't. The Grand National, I think is one. Horse racing, doesn't bother me at all. The FA Cup final, yeah, that's important. But there are a number of sporting events. The boat race as well. I don't really understand the boat race, but people really like it. They cannot be sold at market rates. The Premier League, the Premiership Rugby, all of the weekly can be sold at market rates, but there are certain events which are so centrally important to our culture, they have to be on free-to-air TV and they have to be available to the public. Wimbledon as well is another one. And they are so important, they have to be kept separately. But even now, you find it difficult to see those just on the one broadcaster. So the rugby is now split between ITV, the commercial broadcaster, and the BBC. The Rugby World Cup was split between ITV and the BBC. So there's now a greater degree of choice and ability for the commercial channels to actually monetize some of the value of the broadcast rights. So in terms of our regulatory environment, I think we have a useful underpinning of regulation and rules. So we have the rules on fair trading. We have a provision within the fair trading elements of the BBC Charter, which require the BBC Trust, which is its independent regulator, to have a 3-yearly review of those fair trading rules, which is published and is done by Ofcom, which is the independent regulator for communications, telecoms, broadband, and to some extent other media elements, which throws up this debate every 3 years. So there is an independent review carried out by an independent regulator. If the BBC acts in an anti-competitive way, it can potentially come up in front of the Competition and Markets Authority, which it did on a possible joint venture, which was called Project Kangaroo, if ever you want to Google the thing, which is around trying to create a single video-on-demand download service where all of the main broadcasters got together to create a single service, which was really not particularly positively viewed from a competition standpoint. We now have a multiplicity of download services which actually function very well, and which I think prove that effective competition enforcement does a good job. So we have those key elements. I think when you look at where things are moving forward and why I think those two key strands mean that we actually don't have huge fights as much anymore around media regulation, because we have rules and we have fair trading rules and fairly strict tie-ins to existing competition law and competition rules, and we have independent regulation on every step of the core market. So when we come back to what is the future of TV, the Competition Commission had a case a couple of years ago on broadcasting of movies on pay TV, and I wasn't on the panel. And I remember hearing about the report, and it was a few years ago, so you have to forgive me. And I'm being honest about my bad reaction to this. They said, look, we don't actually think there's much of a problem with the pay TV market anymore because Netflix and Amazon and whatever are coming into the market. And I had Netflix at the time, this is about 5 years ago, and I thought, really? I mean, Netflix just shows crappy 1980s movies I didn't want to watch at the time. There was never anything that I could find to watch on Netflix at the time because it actually wasn't very good. And here we were passing a market which I thought there must be a problem with on the basis of potential competition from Netflix and Amazon. And that always reminds me that unless you actually know what you're talking about, you shut up, is the first one. And secondly, that things can actually move in this market quite quickly. And the important thing is to make sure that you have the rules and the institutions in place to allow that innovation to occur. Because if you don't, you stifle innovation in ways that you can't predict. And if you stifle innovation in ways that you can't predict, in a sense, you don't know what you've lost. And so, to conclude on what I think we have, or what the UK experience shows, is that when you have core principles to your regulatory system around public service broadcasting and fair trading, you have a good start. So you have core principles that people understand about what they should and shouldn't do in the marketplace. And secondly, you have independent regulation. you have BBC Trust, you have Ofcom, and you have the CMA, potentially as a backstop. So you have independent regulation, you have rules that everyone understands on how to play the game. And as a result, we have far fewer, I think, debates about fundamentals of media regulation in the UK than you may find elsewhere. And we have a much greater diversity of both broadcast media and successful independent production companies who supply to both the public service and to the commercial sector and do very well out of it, from what I can gather. And I think that's because the focus for us is always on consumer welfare and consumer experience. So what is it that we can do to enhance consumer welfare and enhance the consumer experience, and also ensure that whatever regulatory system we have allows innovation to flourish and creates, in a sense, a permissionless environment for innovation to actually deliver for consumers, which is what, in a sense, all of us in this market should be all about. So hopefully I've not bored you too much, and thank you for your attention.